Hello, I'm Stuart Crainer. Welcome to this series of monthly webinars inside ecosystems, brought to you by the Business Ecosystem Alliance. Our aim at the Business Ecosystem Alliance is to further knowledge of the ideas and best practice driving the new generation of business ecosystems. The profusion of ideas, tools, and frameworks seeking to better understand ecosystems means nothing if it can't be converted into organizational reality. There's nothing so practical as a great idea. So today we will hear from the frontline where ideas meet practice. We're joined by Kaihan Krippendorff, CEO of Outthinker and best-selling author of Driving Innovation from Within and a host of other bestsellers. Kalina Nikolova, Vice President of Business Operations and Strategy at Verizon Media, and Alok K, Agrawal, CSO at Celestica. So let's get things started. Kaihan, you see the development and the evolution of strategy across many, many different industries. What do you see the role of ecosystems playing in the future?
Yeah, because of the nature of the work that we do, I get to interact with heads of strategy across many different industries. So I kind of can connect patterns and see behaviors. First, I would say that as we've been looking at ecosystems are not new, right? 70% of society's most impactful innovations have come primarily from employees, and most of those are from employees across different industries that convene together to try to solve a big problem, like how do we create the internet? How do we advance DNA sequencing? How do we advance clean energy and solar and solar technology? So what you see is a long history of companies, organizations, and I wouldn't say just companies, but private and public sector companies coming together to solve a big problem. I think that's one big driver of ecosystems. If we're talking about ecosystems outside of the organization, because I think you also have ecosystems within an organization. But if we're talking about ecosystems kind of cross agents across in an industry or in the world, having a common purpose drives greater collaboration. And I think that we're starting to see a greater need, or at least awareness of the need to solve macro problems that affect society, right? We need to deal with water shortage. We need to deal with global warming. We need to deal with poverty, right? And if you take the UN Sustainable Development Goals, that's an example of an entity that is trying to focus organizations to create ecosystems around different societal shared challenges. You multiply that with technology, right? We have technology that enables us to collaborate more effectively. We've got IoT plugging into data analytics that allows organizations to share a greater variety of information and coordinate that. And, we see technologies that enable informal communities to form. What happened in the United States with GameStop, for example, and a group of investors coming together to drive up stock prices. We're seeing that kind of behavior enabled by whatever that is, Reddit or Slack or any of these social platforms. So we can now organize more quickly. So whereas before we had a need, but it took us some time to organize, now we have the need elevated and we have the ability to organize. And then the third component, in my view, is behavior. So that changes behaviors. So we start seeing organizations organize in different ways, creating more, informal marketplaces internally. One member of the Business Ecosystem Alliance, Hire, for example, has a really interesting model to break down its hierarchy into these little micro enterprises that effectively create an ecosystem. So you start seeing behaviors change. Now, what's interesting is when behaviors change, then we start thinking, hey, there are new things that we could do. And so we start looking for new technologies and new problems to solve. So it starts becoming this virtuous cycle, right? Where we have technology, needs, and behaviors driving new technologies and needs. And so while ecosystems have been around for many years, I think that we're starting to step into an era where that type of coordination could be a dominant form of organization going forward. So, I think that's kind of what I see as kind of the drivers that are leading us to an age in which ecosystems become more prevalent, especially the ecosystems that are multi-agent ecosystems.
Thanks, Kaihan. I think you've covered quite a lot of angles there. I think it is important to kind of understand that ecosystems aren't new. I guess they've always existed, but what's new is looking at organizations through an ecosystems lens, I guess. But I think the big points you make about the importance of collaboration, the big challenges society and organizations face, the rise of technology, and the changes in individual and organizational behavior are a great framing of the issues we face and the issues that ecosystems go some way to tackling. Alok, can I come to you next? How are you seeing ecosystems develop in your industry, and what are the drivers of this?
Thanks, Stuart. Appreciate the introduction. Happy to be here. Before maybe I get into the answer, I'd maybe talk a little bit about Celestica, because I think that will obviously help people put context to my answers. So Celestica, it's one of these companies like many. We're quite large, but no one's ever heard of us. We're a $6 billion company. We're actually spun out of IBM about 25 years ago. And our business broadly is supply chain services. And what that means varies very much based on how you define the ecosystem. And that's what I'll get into. But our services extend all the way from design to manufacturing, to return, logistics, et cetera. So if you look at this broader industry, though, right, so maybe I pick it up not just as Celestica, but I think our broader industry I'd characterize as electronics hardware. And that includes OEMs, it includes manufacturers, it includes design houses. And, if you think about the companies in this space, depending on how you count it, this could be a multi-trillion-dollar industry that's really quite global. I think the number one thing that's driving, I think, more of a focus on ecosystems in our space is that OEMs, right, who are our end customers, we're a B2B business, really looking for what I would characterize simplification in their supply chain, because they're focusing so much elsewhere when they're putting their capital dollars. So there's a couple different things that means. So one is that they want more and more what I'd characterize life cycle support. So they're no longer saying, hey, just manufacture for me, here's design, be done with it. They're saying, I'd like to go focus more on services. I'd like to go focus more on next generation designs. Can I give you more? And that's the first question that kind of comes to us, right? Is you'd like to give us more. How do we most efficiently get that? And the challenge we often face is when they say we want you to do more, it's like, well, what is that, right? A life cycle has a different meaning to everybody else. For one company, it means going more forward. So I want you to help me with design, innovation, purchasing. For others, it could be aftermarket. Help me with repair, logistics, final assembly, whatever else. And because of that, if you're looking from Celestica's standpoint, we operate in 6 industries globally. It's tough for us to maybe go the traditional route to get those capabilities, which could be organic or M&A. And we'll talk about what that means for us in the second point. For those of you that do know our business, we know that we're very scrappy, tightly run, low margin business. That's just the reality of it for a variety of reasons. And because of that, like any other company, capital is precious, but for us, it's exceptionally precious, is what I would say. And if we looked at it and said, well, the customers are asking us to do more, and of course, we want to meet our customers' needs. First thing we would ordinarily think of, which is actually the EMS industry came to be where it was, is we'd buy a bunch of this stuff or build it organically. Let's go get design capabilities. Let's go get aftermarket capabilities. The problem is, not just from a capital standpoint, but from if you're in 6 industries, 10 countries, you rarely can find one company, 2 companies you buy that would cover everything you need. So realistically, we cannot go do that. We just simply cannot go do that. And we found also the needs tend to evolve. And maybe one customer wants this, another customer wants that. It evolves 3 years later. And obviously an acquisition should not be based on a 1-year, one customer business case. So we tend to do a lot more partnerships because we think that's a more efficient way to keep both sides flexible. Those partnerships can evolve into M&A and evolve into more formal relationships, but that's our starting point. And the last one I think is most exciting, is this convergence, that we're really seeing now between technology and industrials, I would call it broadly. So the way Celestica is organized, we have 2 separate business units. One that's sort of focused on tech products. We call it cloud computing and services. So typical, large scale cloud computing customers, et cetera. Leading edge technology, AI, machine learning, blockchain, really high innovative products that we're helping them deliver. And the other side is the more traditional industrial companies who still need technology, still need industrial products. We're seeing more convergence now. So both sides are asking about each other, right? The customers on the tech side are asking about industrial, what's going on there, what's happening. And the industrial folks are saying, I want to be connected. I want to have servers on my products. How does that look? And because of that convergence, we're seeing that there's actually an ecosystem to Kaihan's earlier point, building within our company amongst the two different areas. And I only expect these to grow, honestly, right? If I look at what's happening now, the industry is consolidated. I mean, there's not much more we can do in terms of combining and getting bigger. This is going to be the way of the future, is partnerships and ecosystem development. And because of COVID, I think this has accelerated this idea of focusing what you're good at, right? Let someone else handle regionalization supply chain. And so they want maximum flexibility. Hey, listen, give me a menu. I want your menu to be quite large, what you can do for me. And then I'll tell you how best to use your menu. So there's an ask of the menu bigger. And, ecosystem also, it just drives value for the customer. And to me, that's the first thing. If the customer wants it, and the customer sees the value of it, it's going to be a focus for our industry. So I think it's very exciting. I think this industry has gone through a lot of different cycles. I think now we're in the ecosystem partnership kind of, the menu, as I always call it, kind of life cycle, right? How we add to the menu.
Yeah, thank you, Alok. I think that's every company's dream, isn't it? To be a $6 billion company nobody's ever heard of.
Sometimes it's for a benefit, absolutely.
That's very well. And so our third guest is Kalina Nikolova from Verizon Media, which is certainly a company that virtually everybody's heard of, I think, because it's home to some fantastic brands like TechnoCrunch, Autoblog, and Yahoo, and so on. So, Kalina, what are the implications for how an organization such as yours changes its approach to strategy because of ecosystems?
Thank you, Stuart, and wonderful to be here. It's such a great question, and I really want to build on what Kaihan and Alok said. I think it comes down to kind of two things that I want to talk about. It comes down to, one, where do we anchor all of this? Like, where do we anchor kind of the future, the development, and how we all create value in ecosystems? And at the end of the day, this is the ultimate customer. And when I say the words customer, what I mean by that is both whether it's an individual person, a consumer, in our lingo, or it's a business customer. It doesn't matter whether it's a B2B business or whether it's a B2C type thinking. Ultimately, kind of the how the ecosystem justifies its existence and justifies its development is anchored in how we build more value for those end customers. And what is really interesting in terms of what is happening right now and how we think about the strategy, it builds on what Alok is saying, and I'm just going to say it, I think, in slightly different words. There's been like cycles in generations of ecosystems, if you will, that have kind of started a long time ago, and they just keep evolving. One ecosystem matures, another one develops and happens, etc. And the reason that is happening is also because the industries are going through certain life cycles, and also because the consumer and business customer needs and preferences are evolving. So anchoring that back to what Kaihan was saying, kind of that needs word in the middle, that has been evolving really, really interesting. And Stuart, you mentioned some of the amazing brands that I'm lucky to be working on. Yahoo and AOL are enormous digital brands. We're talking billions of consumers. These are billions of touch points, and billions of data points. I'll get to the data conversation in just a second. But those are relationships that have really been evolving. Yahoo turned 26 years old this year. So over those many years, the first ecosystems, like in digital media, probably were around, okay, let's get to the consumer. Kaihan mentioned the internet. Okay, now the internet is existing. Now we have this amazing technological ability to get to the consumer. Let's get to the consumer. That was kind of the first ecosystem, was about how to create the content, how to build kind of the websites, to build the connection. And there was like a lot of players in that ecosystem. Then that started maturing, consolidating, the big players established. Then you started moving into the monetization of that. How do you create kind of the advertising space around that, et cetera, et cetera. And it kept kind of creating these new ecosystems. And today we're looking at something very interesting, something that is really anchored, and I'll start with the consumer kind of piece of it, anchored in like, how do you build value for the consumer? And I like to talk about this using another framework, which is about connections, like building more connections for the consumer, whether it's between consumers or between product and consumer, or it's consumer and brands and business brands. How to build more connections is becoming this kind of new currency for the ecosystems today. And in order to create that, the way we started thinking about kind of strategy and how we work in the marketplace is exactly to be having this ecosystem mindset. So Alok said it for different reasons in his case, like they can't do it alone. In our case, it's because there's just so much. There's so many consumers with different needs. There's so much you need to know about the consumers, and there's so many different ways how you can create those connections. And then when we think about the original question you asked, Stuart, is like, how does that evolve our thinking in terms of strategy? In each one of those kind of dimensions, we think about how do we create the best value for whether it's a consumer or a business customer. So take the notion of kind of data and privacy, which is such a sensitive topic, and there's like very large ecosystems of issues and companies that are kind of coalescing around that and starting to say, how do we create a safe environment? How do we create an environment where we learn more about the consumer and we actually give them something they really care about, give them something from a content or subscription perspective that is personalized to them, give them something from an advertising perspective that is also kind of speaks to them and it's kind of catered to what they're looking for. There's so many players in that ecosystem that and we're balancing all together how we think about these issues for the consumer, how we think about safety. There's a whole host of companies that are creating the enabling technology to aggregate that data, to make it private, to make it secure. There's a host of companies that help us personalize things. How do we deal with consumer data, CRM systems for consumers, gather the data that they're willing to share, use that to create better content, use that to create better advertising, whole other ecosystem around that. Advertising, and now there's like this new mantra of advertising, closing the loop. It's not new, but there's more technology, I would say, available, closing the loop between advertising digitally and retail. So this notion of kind of how you connect a retailer with their physical location, with their digital conversation with the consumer, with their digital advertising to the consumer, close that through purchasing and rewards programs, that is a whole other new ecosystem that we're now playing with. So it's really this notion of every piece of how we build value for the consumer while we're still anchoring in that North Star. Stuart, you said that kind of all of us kind of looking for the common good and kind of trying to create the bigger common good. With all of those ecosystems aligned around that and not thinking of it as like a one company, but thinking of it as a portfolio of company, as a partnership at all times across everything we do. That was a very long answer, but hopefully it kind of sets us up maybe for some more interesting questions. Thank you.
And the notion of connections, the idea of connections, which you allude to, you're a big fan of the content trap by Barrett and Anand, aren't you?
Admit it. Absolutely.
And you use that as a good practical way in, you find?
That's exactly what I was alluding to, and I didn't mention the name, but thank you so much for mentioning it. Big fan, and it really breaks it down into something exactly very practical, because it helps us think through the building blocks of those connections. So there's connections between a user and a product. There's functional connections in terms of what jobs they're kind of fulfilling by using that product. And then there's the user connections themselves. This is like the whole, premise of social media, like the connections between users and users. And when you start thinking of those as kind of all of them being possibilities in how we build value for the consumers, it gives you so much ground to play. It gives you so many ideas of how to better create that value for the consumer. And another thing I like to say a lot is ecosystems have to think not just about how to create the value and how to divide the value. Of course, everybody thinks, what is my role in the ecosystem and how can I capture the most value? But more about how do we grow the pie together? Because then there's more value for everyone. And that's where I find Bharat's work so incredibly useful, because that gives you all these points, all these dimensions of how to grow the pie, create more user connections. They're going to come even more. They're going to spend even more time, create better connections between them and the product. That's what's going to make them kind of seek more products, seek more information about products. This is the holy grails of advertisers, of retailers, etc. So these are really kind of almost like a playbook of how the ecosystems can grow the pie and there's more value for everybody.
Stuart, if I could add to Kalina said, actually, because something she said really resonated with me, the way she laid it out was this idea of, because with ecosystems, right, to Kalina's point, there's not always a clear framework, right? Every relationship you develop, every way you try to grow the pie is different, whereas in M&A, whatever else, there's a bit of a playbook that you can kind of run. But I really like the way she characterized, and that's the way I think about it too, right, is the conversations you have with potential partners Should not be, well, hey, how's the financials going to work? Who's going to have whatever else? It should be, okay, listen, I believe we together are better than us separately. What do we do together to make a value? And then we'll figure out how to split up the value later based on, whatever we get to. But that's the right way to characterize. I think when you do that and open it up that way, people really kind of put their thinking hats on and think through, okay, yeah, right, how do we actually work together in a different format versus maybe getting ourselves wrapped around financials and agreements and whatever else that often slow down the process.
Please send in your questions if you're watching us. There's a question from Alexandra who's joining us from Poland. What has been the biggest challenge for you in tackling business ecosystems? And it strikes me that one of the biggest issues must be explaining what an ecosystem is. I mean, what kind of reaction do you get? So you say to your colleagues or people outside or the organization or your customers, we see this as an ecosystem. Do people shrug their shoulders, shake their heads? What kind of reaction do you get, Alok?
Yeah, it's I would say it depends. The word, it's like a lot of words, I guess, in business, right? I mean, the word, I think, it's important to have a word so that people can understand what you're talking about or sort of have a common language. But to me, the explanation really matters a lot, right? So if you tell someone, hey, we're building an ecosystem, they may scratch their head a little bit. But I think when you explain a little bit and say, well, we view that as basically broadening our value proposition and working with other parts of our business, our related businesses, customers, suppliers, whatever else, it sort of resonates. I think the trick, though, I guess I would say, right, is that the more that you can sort of, I would say, build an ecosystem on top of an idea, I think that resonates a lot. So I'll give you a great example. We look to our business teams, obviously, for a lot of our ecosystem partner opportunities. I mean, they're on the ground, they're in the business, they know the space. And, often they'll come to me and say, hey, listen, I'm interested, maybe we should talk to this company, we can work something on. I said, oh, yeah, this is a great add to our ecosystem. I think then they get it. Like, okay, I get what you're saying now because I have a context of sort of what I was looking at, and I understand what you're saying, how that fits in. And I think that's the way pragmatically to think about it, right? Is that explain to people that ecosystem in itself is not a concept. It's how things fit into an ecosystem, I think, helps it resonate more with people.
Kaihan, one of the things that's kind of emerging, I know Alok just said that there's not a clear framework. And it strikes me always, I know the Chinese company you mentioned, Hire, very well. And visiting them in China, what's always struck me has been the ambiguity and vagueness of it all. I mean, they talk about ecosystems, micro enterprises. I mean, there's an awful lot. There's a lot of collaboration going on, but there's an awful lot of trust and there's an awful lot of grey areas. You've got to be comfortable with that.
Yeah, it seems like it's almost like maybe it's the 2020 hindsight. Like you realize you have built an ecosystem and it looks just like a set of different partnerships, and then you realize, hey, we're kind of we've got this network of partnerships or relationships. When you call it a platform, then people can understand what that is, but then there's one person who owns it, right, and manages it. So ecosystems, I guess, are more organic, and so just it's I guess harder to explain it up front, but maybe you don't need to. To Alok's point, you don't need to explain it up front. It can just be a partnership.
Well, what about from your point of view, Kalina? I mean, you're a digital media company. Trust is central to what you offer, really. Do you think that's helped you, or ecosystems help you build that trust, or make you better equipped to create ecosystems? Your understanding of how trust works, perhaps.
It's such a big word for us, and I did not plant it, I promise, because I can talk for hours about trust. Trust is central to our brand. It's central to how we talk to both consumers and advertisers. That's it. Trust in terms of no fake news, trust in terms of we're going to use your data in a way that actually benefits you, etc. It is absolutely the cornerstone of digital media these days. Has it helped us, or has it made it more difficult? It's actually both in a good way, and it's kind of working in a symbiotic way. Of course, it made it more difficult because you have to create the enabling technologies to kind of keep the data safe. You have to create the enabling workflows and relationships and clarity to the consumer to explain, here's how I'm using a certain set of data to make your experience better. Of course, that is more difficult. But that also creates more value at the same time, because where the consumers have anxiety, that's also where they're looking for the value. There's like, I kind of want a more personalized content, but I want to know how you're using my data. Therefore, we make it very clear for them to opt in, opt out. We make it very easy. We make it very clear to understand how we're using such and such. And again, when I say we, I mean the ecosystem, because this is not possible to be done by one. These things are very complex, both technologically. There's legal companies involved. There's technology, et cetera, et cetera. There's really a big ecosystem. And I think the challenge that this posed to us actually made us better ultimately. So yes, it was more difficult at first, but then it gave, to my previous point of like creating value, it gave another dimension to us all as an ecosystem to build the next thing, to build the next thing that is actually better for the consumer and better for the business customer. I mean, I keep using the consumer, but I'm actually sitting in the B2B part of the organization. But we always think B2B2C, just to kind of use that terminology real quick. On the B2B side, same thing. You know, how do we create trust with our advertisers? How do we create trust with the publishers that we work with? We work with both kind of sides of the equation. And how do we connect them better in a way that makes one side smarter about the other? Advertisers smarter about how they connect to the content where they're placing in their messages. Publishers being smarter about how to find, you know, the best advertisers and the best consumers that they want to place, you know, in terms of messages on their content. So we absolutely, you know, even from a B2B perspective, trust is absolutely the currency as well. How do you create those relationships that are beneficial for both?
If I could add something as well, build on that, you know, that I see our chief strategy officers that are part of our network that, you know, that they kind of, there are two themes. One is, how do I monetize my contribution to the ecosystem? And another one is kind of, what's the purpose of the ecosystem? And I think that what you hear in Kalina and Alok's kind of entry point to being open to ecosystems is a customer-centric view. Hey, we're going to do this because it creates value for our customer, and we'll figure out how we're going to capture our value, right? So a company that's not customer-centric, I think is going to get into an issue where at the beginning, before you enter this agreement, you're going to want a business case that says we're going to capture 13.5% of the whatever, and then you don't step in. So I think that being customer-centric is
no, that's actually right there is an answer to the question that was asked earlier. You know, what are some of the biggest challenges? That is the challenge. We haven't been good enough. We haven't been disciplined enough as kind of parts of the ecosystems to start with that question first, with the customer-centric question first. Like we go straight into the percentages, like who owns the platform or who participates, instead of, you know, let's first solve for the value.
And I think tactically, you know, I think everything Kalina and kind of said is spot on. You know, almost have to have a different mindset that's than what's typical, I guess, in these conversations. It's, I have an idea, you know, you go to the partner, you go to your ecosystem partner, I have an idea, and listen, here's how I'm thinking about it. And that's it. And you have a conversation about it. What are you guys seeing, whatever else, and it evolves that way. And I think the trade-off of that, which a lot of organizations struggle with, it just might take time. It may not be like an immediate payoff. It may not be, you know, a business case the next day. But to everyone's point, right, if we think it'll create value for the customer, there will be a way to make money from it collectively. Let's just not worry about it. So let's focus on finding the answer first, what makes sense for the customer, and then worry about all the other details. Which is why often I think in terms of where this resides, right, tactically is a big conversation with our company is where should this kind of activity reside, right? And there's pros and cons everywhere, but I think putting it in kind of corporate level strategy of organizations has been helpful. I think that's the level where you still have, you know, kind of an M&A bet to yourself, but you also know the business quite well because you're part of the businesses. So you're kind of the right person to kind of put the pieces together on where partnerships could make sense.
There's a related question coming from Sheena. What should be the initial governance model of an ecosystem? How do you gain other people's engagement? I suppose the question there is, how much do you have to map it out? I mean, Alok talked about a leap of faith, but how much do you have to have it mapped out, and how much do you have to leave it vague and let the value emerge? Right. Kalina, have you got ideas on that?
It's not an easy question, and it was, I think Kaihan or Alok mentioned it earlier. Ecosystems are more organic beasts. They're not as structured as, you know, here's a partnership between three parties and here's exactly how it's going to work. So a governance per se in ecosystems, usually, at least I can speak for my industry, usually it looks more like industry organizations as opposed to some sort of a commercial governance, because it's so diverse and there's just so many players and there's so many different aspects of how, different players participate in the ecosystem. So the closest I have seen to a formal governance in that we're doing as an industry is more along the lines of industry organizations. So they tend to be organized, some of them around measurement, some of them around like certain, formats in the ecosystem. And that's where I actually have seen, at least in the media industry, a pretty intense involvement, through boards, through subcommittees, pretty intense involvement of members. I was just sitting in one of those steering committees 2 weeks ago to talk about like, what are we grappling with as an industry in a certain area and kind of solve it together. It's very interesting that those bodies, people, I've been in this for like 25 years at this point. And it's interesting that they're those industry organizations are typically spoken about as like, oh, it's so slow to get these things done in these organizations, etc. But at the same time, they work very intensely. There's a lot of work that happens. And I think that is a really good, how should I say that's a really good reason for that. And the reason is exactly because ecosystems are not an easy beast. They're not about like telling the ecosystem what to do. An ecosystem is alive and changing, and it's about a North Star. It's about guiding principles. It's about bringing value. And that's actually what ends up being discussed in those industry organizations. And then down the subcommittees, you start getting into some technologies. You start getting into some, let's allow this, let's create this standard. Let's everybody try to use this and that, but that becomes the more tactical. Of course, that takes time. And also it kind of evolves over time. So it kind of keeps changing. So from a media industry perspective, I would say that's how I have seen governance work. If it's between companies, then it becomes more of a commercial relationship as opposed to, and then of course there's governance of that, but that gets down to a specific kind of, couple sides, couple of, parties, commercial relationship as opposed to a larger governance of an ecosystem.
There's a related question from Torben. How do you ensure that all ecosystem participants receive the right knowledge to fully exploit the value of the ecosystem? And I think that's getting to the point you were making, Alok, about it being a leap of faith. If you're sharing information, then people can figure out where the value lies, but you've got to share the information and be willing to share that information.
I think it builds on a couple of points I think that the group has talked about. One is trust. So I think one important thing is that, and again, a lot of companies, it's a struggle, right? Because we're not necessarily used to working this way. You may have to take a bit of, when I say leap of faith and trust. Like here, I'm going to share a little bit with you, right? And again, the commercial arrangement, NDAs, whatever else, of course you should do that, right? But to some degree, you have to trust that, hey, I'm going to share with you about my business and give you an understanding of what I'm doing. And the expectations, you do the same. Like you tell me about your business. I would say though, we should, I tend to like to say, come in with an idea. I would say, come with an idea to have the conversation, let it build from there. But I do agree, if you don't let people know what you're doing, it's going to be hard for them to figure out how you work together. Because I think the function of why you're talking to them is because you don't know what they're doing exactly. You don't know how they can help you, that you want to have the conversation. So again, I'll bring it back to an example, maybe building back on the governance. I always think about like a Venn diagram. Like, listen, I do all of this stuff, you do all this stuff, and I know there's like 2% of overlap. And let's talk about the 2% of overlap, because I know conceptually that's like a proof of concept we can work on. I don't want to tell you about my 98. I want to hear about your 98, because maybe my Venn diagram is wrong and actually overlap 30-40% is a gigantic opportunity here. And that's why I think the best partnerships or the best ecosystem partners, it works on a crawl, walk, run. These relationships, you rarely, I've done it before, just do a cold call with an ecosystem partner and say, hey, I've never worked with you. I don't know you. We've never even talked before. Let's talk and let's work. It often starts with the crawl, walk, run. Some salesperson or team knows a person from the other company. They've worked together. They've talked about ideas, whatever else, and you build from there. And either approach has its pros and cons, but I think to me, 2%, 3%, 4% overlap is actually okay to start a conversation, but have the openness and trust to see maybe that 2% should actually be 20. And, in terms of prioritizing in your ecosystem program, okay, 20%, I better really focus on this one. There's a lot of value to be built here for the customer.
I think the question of openness is really core as well. I know, Kalina, you partner with some of your competitors in some of your ecosystems. Is that right?
Absolutely. Who doesn't? I think at this point we're all.
But
I mean, coming back to that notion of like we're all doing the best to kind of serve the customer and serve the business or consumer. Absolutely. I mean, sometimes we're competitors and sometimes we're partners for different aspects of what we do.
I think probably companies have been collaborating with their competitors for decades or centuries. It's always been that way, but it hasn't been expressed openly, I guess.
I think there's it. Yes, it's an old thing. It definitely has been happening. I mean, I've said this to Kaihan many times. Some days I sit here and I think my MBA is obsolete, but we did study those companies during my MBA many years ago. We talked about this. We talked about how companies can be both, and I've seen it kind of evolve in my 20-something years since I've worked. I think what's really interesting, it comes back to what Alok was talking about. I think companies are now much more aware and educated about the benefit of revealing to each other more of the aspects of what they do and partnering on more levels. And that inevitably puts you as a company in different seats for different parts of the value chain. Sometimes you're the provider, sometimes you're the receiver. And that is now considered normal behavior. And we absolutely work. I mean, there's no secret here. We work with Google on both sides. We're competitors and we're huge partners. We work with Apple on both sides. We're competitors and we're huge partners. All of those big companies, and I'm mentioning some extreme examples, but there's many others where we kind of play different roles. And that's another part of the beauty of ecosystems. You know, a commercial relationship kind of is more rigid. An ecosystem is the whole. I mean, all of those roles are kind of part of the ecosystem.
Maybe I could add to that as well, right? I think the other beauty of an ecosystem is that it's built on itself, right? It's the network effect is real, right? So to Kalina's point, you start small, and again, you call an ecosystem a platform. Maybe there's 2 or 3 different services or products or offerings you have in that system. Once you start that and starts getting out there, not to say it becomes easier, but then you might have people approaching you. Like, I've heard you guys have this sort of, grouping together of different, of collective offering that you're offering on the market. Hey, maybe I could be the, another passenger on this vehicle that you guys are building. And so I think in some ways the beauty of a good ecosystem, right? Obviously, if it's a good one and people are noticing it, it does become, self-propelling, right? You do sort of have more opportunities come up, and it just gets bigger and bigger. And again, just more value for the customer.
Yeah.
So how do you measure the success of ecosystems? I mean, they don't, as Kalina said, they don't have any kind of right to exist. They have to justify their existence. So do you go in with you've got to go in with a very clear idea of what success is?
Yeah, maybe I'll start. And obviously, I think to me, it's there's a time for the business case. I think we have to also keep in mind, maybe I want to go the other extreme to say, talk for 2 years and just have an open conversation. Eventually, you have to get to, well, what do we view as success collectively, right? I would say we shouldn't be too strict about it. Like, it's hard to say, yeah, I won that business because of the ecosystem. It's not so binary. So you have to pick reasonable expectations, I guess, about, listen, yes, we won more business collectively because of this. Here's some programs I can identify that I really know because of us working together, the customer saw the value and whatever else. To me, you have to have that mindset. But I would say again, it's tough for companies to do this, right? Some of it's got to be a little bit ambiguous, because the one for one never happens. You can't just say it's because of the ecosystem, but you should be able to tie back some key wins or key events, key financial metrics at some level to the fact that you have this offering available.
Yeah, I would just add to that. It's almost like a hierarchy of metrics. Mapping. If you think of the hierarchy of value that you're creating, there's kind of high order North Star value that is exactly what Alok was saying. They're really, really hard to capture. It takes more time. This is where we've expanded the pie. So there's probably something there that is like 1 or 2 super simple metrics, and then under that, inevitably, we're all also running businesses. Of course, you're going to look at kind of the financials. Of course, you're going to look at the individual metrics for the individual business and what matters, how many customers in such and such area, how many consumers did you touch, how much did you improve customer satisfaction, etc. So I would think of it that way. I would think of it, you need all of the above. And the ones on top are kind of the harder ones. And they typically, in our, as a media industry, at least in our current state, they typically come as like industry metrics. Here's kind of what's happening in this industry. Consumers are consumer sentiment towards XYZ is whatever. And then you get down to the more individual ones by business. You need both.
I think if you start with the customer experience, right, and you're selling something that would benefit by your customer having a greater experience, you know that you're gonna monetize that. So I'm thinking one of our members is the head of strategy of a company that does real estate. So and so you buy a house, good chance that one of his companies are going to be selling the house or buying the house. And so then they approached us about they kind of started creating not quite an ecosystem, but a packaged offering. So when you buy a house, what else do you need? Oh, I need to get a Sonos system, or I need to get a Bose system. I need to get a gardener. I need to get solar panels. And so could we put together a collection of companies that would give you a special offer that when you buy the house, hey, we can get a discount on all of those things, right? And so they know that they're going to benefit from that because the customer experience being better means that it's gonna, they trust that they're gonna monetize. And what's interesting is we don't know, they don't know who is going to step in, what partners are going to step into that, but the partners can look at that opportunity themselves and decide whether it makes sense for them to step in. If someone buys a house, are they likely to buy our sound system or not? And if not, then they won't step in. So I think that, if you start with the customer journey, that's a good kind of beginning measure, and you can trust that if you're playing an important role there, that you'll financially benefit.
And maybe I could add, because I think it builds on a point, we kind of talked about a little bit, as culture. I think too is also, as you think about, building ecosystems, a lot of companies, this is a new concept, that there is going to be a little bit more ambiguity and whatever else. So I think one of the things when it comes to metrics, or let's say, right, you have to get the organization around the idea that, I don't know yet, right? I don't exactly know what it's going to be, but culturally that should be okay, right? And again, you have to crawl, walk, run. Maybe in your first year of building ecosystems, you don't say, I'm going to try to do 20 of these. You say, okay, I'm going to do a couple, and you build from there. Because I think for a lot of organizations, even ours, right, we're a very, tech-forward company, but we have very tight margins. And so there's a little bit of a leap of faith to say, let's go spend time and work it. But now it's been, again, self-propelling, and we've developed a culture where it's okay. But, I would say just make sure you enter the journey at the right step. Otherwise, the company may have organ rejection, and then it just goes nowhere.
And I just want to mention and emphasize what Kaihan said. It really struck me when you said the customer journey, and we've all talked about the value and being customer-centric, but something else you said, Kaihan, is like it crosses industries. The moment you start thinking about the customer experience, the customer doesn't care that this is classified as this industry, and this is that other industry, and this is kind of sound technology, and this is real estate. It's all one holistic experience, which completely, on one hand, makes it more difficult because we are not accustomed to thinking across industries as businesses and to measure across industries. But on the other hand, it opens up even more doors for creating value. So back to that earlier question, what has been more difficult and what has been more challenging? Here's yet another example. All the examples I gave, I stayed within the media industry because these ecosystems are so intense and so big that we're kind of living in those ecosystems. But that's not it. I mean, you can think even bigger, because the customer, whether it's a business customer or a consumer, they don't live by industry classifications. The customer experience runs across.
It strikes me that both of you work in fairly complicated organizations. So Celestica is in 6 segments: aerospace and defense, health technology, industrial, capital equipment, enterprise communications, and cloud computing. And Verizon's got a host of brands under its control. I wonder if the willingness of complicated organizations to embrace ecosystems is greater than relatively simple businesses, because perhaps you're comfortable with a level of complexity and interaction between the different parts of your business. Just a theory of mine. Maybe
I'll start. I would say yes. I would say, again, I've said I worked for many years. What strikes me at Verizon Media is this notion of more comfort with the ambiguity and more comfort with being scrappy and startup-y as a culture. And I think that's very much a function of the history of the company. It's a lot of, the company has come together through many, many M&As and kind of building more and more kind of bigger portfolios for the consumer. I would say yes. I do think that level of knowledge and history in the DNA of the company for being that ecosystem internally also translates into more openness and more, I would say, being braver. I guess when you think about ecosystems externally as well.
Yeah, maybe I'll add to that very quickly. It's I agree. I was just reflecting. It's a great question actually to think about a little bit. I think with Celestica, the reason it works is because, a little bit what Kalina said, we have a very decentralized organization. So we give people a lot of, you own your P&L. If you want to go try something with a strategy team or whatever, that's okay, right? You're accountable for it. We'll give you the faith that you can go do it. I think what helps also is we tend to, we allow anyone to come up with an idea. We don't necessarily say it's got to be VP or whatever else. Anyone can be an ecosystem designer. And we try to put that ethos and that culture in the company. And it allows, I think, people even at the most, at the lowest levels of the company, right, the most working level, to go think about this stuff and come with ideas. And I think that's why we've been successful at this, is that sort of decentralization, and everyone can be an ecosystem designer attitude, which has helped us a lot.
Kaihan, some final thoughts?
No, that was a great question, and I agree. I think that but being born as a complex organization that allows you to think outside of your industry silos, be open to different kind of levels of relationship or partnerships or deals, right? And being therefore and being also customer focused. I think those all are be good starting points for an organization that will step into ecosystems and play well in that era.
We're out of time. A few kind of thoughts from bringing together what we've been talking about. There's no denying that ecosystems are difficult and challenging, no matter what the organizations, because it's a degree of conceptualizing which is different from what's gone before at the very least, and it's complex. There's no disguising that. But I think your really strong message is about, you got to start with the customer experience and customer value being the starting point. The other point that came across really strongly is that whatever ecosystem you start, it is a leap of faith. It's an organic process, and it, as Kalina says, it takes an element of bravery to start and perhaps to stop an ecosystem. So these are really interesting perspectives. And we really greatly appreciate you joining us today. So that was Kalina Nikolova of Verizon Media. Thank you, Kalina. And Alok Agrawal of Celestica, and Kaihan Krippendorff of Outthinker. Thank you all for joining us and such a great and interesting discussion. We'll be back again in August for our monthly webinar. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.